Just a few decades ago, Charlotte was very different from the place we know today. How have we become America's 17th largest city, home to a dynamic downtown, an array of multinational companies, and major league sports? And why us? This is the story of the people who built modern Charlotte, what drove them, how they made it happen. Operating in a city astride both Carolinas and with no plantation-based aristocracy to limit their ambitions, the builders shared a common shorthand vision: Charlotte as better than Atlanta and without all the traffic.
If you look back in the history of Charlotte and in Mecklenburg County, you look at the fact that we started out as somewhat of a textile town and somewhat of a distribution town. We were always a place that people knew about, but only as a small town of 60 to 80,000 at the turn of the century. We were never a big city. We didn't have a river. We didn't have mountains. We didn't have a coast.
When I came here as a reporter, there was a pulse in Charlotte that you couldn't get in any other city in North Carolina. Charlotte was a meritocracy. Anybody could come here if they were willing to work. The place was wide open to them. First, there were people who were accustomed to hard work because they came from small towns or farms where people worked hard physically, putting in the proverbial full day's work for the full day's pay.
Maybe everybody that's a Charlottean has a little bit of a chip on the shoulder, wanting to be special. There's nothing wrong with a chip if it's positive.
I had a chip on my shoulder, and for me, Charlotte was not good for my business. I mean, I could have been headquartered in Washington or Florida or Dallas, any place, a major city would have been more helpful. I used to do business with New Yorkers who wouldn't come to Charlotte. I had to fly to Atlanta. They said, I'm not coming to Charlotte. You can't get a drink. They said, and you don't have a hotel. I said, well, you've stayed in a Red Carpet Inn. You know, that's nice enough. People stay there. And he said, Jim, if you have to go outside to get to your room, it is not a hotel. I understood my drive was really not as much about quality as was if you're not in the top 25 in this country, nobody cares about you. When you're a top 25 city, guess what? You get an airport, you get Neiman Marcus, you get Trader Joe's, you get Costco, you get everybody. You got to be a top 25 city. You go back a couple generations and they were already thinking about it. They wanted to be a city.
No one was more passionate about making Charlotte a top 25 market than a rising star banker named Hugh McCall, who became president of North Carolina National Bank in 1974.
Southerners, we were really, if you think about it, we were part of a nation that had been defeated. And we had all the negatives of a defeated nation. The most important one being the lack of capital. And all the good business, the big companies, or successful companies, banked either in New York or worse in Winston-Salem with Wachovia. And I knew that you had to attract people to come here from New York or London or South Africa. We were doing business in South Africa. And to get the people to come here, you had to have something more than we had. And so I knew what a city was supposed to look like, and ours surely didn't look that way. It was the most boring damn city I'd ever seen in my whole life. You couldn't buy a drink. They had more churches and bars. It was a remarkably boring town. So I realized that people were what made the cities great. And the main thing I wanted was people living in the center city. Luther Hodges and Bill Doherty and Tom Stores and I met with Mr. Reese, and he had decided to build a new building up on the square, which the 40-story glass tower. And that was a great move north, 1 block, but nobody had gone up that way. And Gooley Odell was in that meeting, and he fascinated me. I listened to him talk.
Downtown Charlotte contains the seat of our county and city government, our great department store. It's the center of the financial interests of North and South Carolina. These are things that only can be contained in the heart of downtown.
And so that was when I first got interested in building a city, was listening to Odell.
We propose for that.
That 66 master plan had a lot of visionary things that were happening. It had a lot of things that didn't make sense either. But he had the vision of saying, Charlotte Center City ought to be more than just a place of employment. It ought to have housing, high-rise housing for that, and that was unheard of. That housing ought to be developed in the soft underbelly of the downtown itself. I mean, it ought to come alive. It ought to be vibrant. It talked about a downtown stadium. These ideas made sense. Hugh McCall and I walked up and down Tryon Street many a days and talked about what made the Champs-Élysées in Paris great and what does Charlotte have to do to get there.
Within 25 years, McCall had taken over Bank of America and moved its headquarters to Charlotte, but not before becoming the architect of the modern city.
Well, I marked at the beginning of the new city to 1974. 3 women came to see me trying to raise some money to save the Berryhill house.
People from the Junior League came to see me. I was sold on their project. One of the important things that we contributed, we were always putting features in the newspaper about projects that we thought were worthwhile. And the women, there were just 2 or 3 of them, their husbands all laughed at them. A person who saw the vision of what this could be.
I can't remember how much money we gave them, maybe $25,000, but in any event, that was sort of the beginning of my interest in Fourth Ward.
The people who were attracted to Fourth Ward became community leaders. Early Fourth Ward residents were the ones who supported Spirit Square, who supported Discovery Place. At one time or another, there were 4 residents of Fourth Ward, not necessarily at the same time, but 4 residents of Fourth Ward who served on the city council. 2 of whom eventually became mayor, Harvey Gantt and Sue Myrick, and 2 of whom became mayor pro tem, and that was Betty Chafin-Rash and Cindy Patterson.
The Publicity, a low-interest loan program developed by McCall's Bank, and city investment in infrastructure led to more residential restorations. The collaboration between private enterprise, public institutions, and philanthropy set the pattern for Charlotte's civic improvements over the next decades.
I got to be CEO of the company, and it was the same year that Harvey Gantt became mayor of the city. So we had a mayor who had advanced degrees in urban planning. We had somebody who was trying to build a company and bring people to town. Candidly, through all of my career, we were executing the Odell plan. When I walk through the city and see the people in the streets and see the people living up above the place, that what I dreamed of happening has happened.
Even as McCall and Neal were promoting Fourth Ward, progress was stalled at what was to become the city's most important engine for growth. Charlotte Douglas International is the 6th busiest airport in the world. That would have seemed improbable in 1975 when Jerry Orr started work as airport engineer.
My background was in land development, planning subdivisions, industrial parks, and so I knew about making the project fit the need, how things work. Yeah, so I had an idea of, in my head, of what the airport ought to look like and what was wrong. And I think there were somewhere between 28 and 32 employees at the airport department. And we want to build a new terminal. We have 16 gates in this terminal. That's for advertising purposes. If you're going to park 16 big airplanes here, we got a problem. It was a shell game. And it was kind of the Western Front. Nobody cared. Downtown, nobody cared what went on out there.
It didn't look like things were going to improve anytime soon, given the 1975 defeat of airport improvement bonds and a lawsuit that stopped construction on a new runway that was vital to expanding the airport's capacity.
And I characterize that as the bottom. We hit rock bottom. It took 3 years. We redid the environmental impact statement. we went back to the airlines and we said, if we were to build a new terminal, what would you like for it to look like?
Orr also reached out to city leaders, especially department store chairman John Belk, a relentless champion of airport expansion before, during, and after his time as Charlotte's mayor.
John Belk had vision. Now, he was a retailer with a lot of stores and a lot of places, but he had vision.
John Belk understood because he was a man who traveled. His horizon was large. He'd been in the service. He'd been in Korea. He'd fought in the Army. He had been all over the world, and he had a bigger picture of what things could be.
I would say probably in the last year of his life, he was still talking about an additional runway. That airport ought to have his name, really. I mean, what he did for that airport and what Jerry Orr did for that airport, it's a driving part of this city.
Among Belk's many acquaintances was Tom Davis, the founder of Winston-Salem-based Piedmont Airlines, which was looking to establish larger Southeast hub operations following the deregulation of the airline industry.
Piedmont was the red-headed stepchild. This was an eastern town. And so everything we did was for Eastern. When I showed up, I treated everybody the same, whether they had one flight or 100. Piedmont and others would say, I wish we could have this or that, and I'd just get it done for them. Other airports weren't necessarily like that.
Of all the developments, the completion of the runway was the most vital.
The parallel runway, what it really allowed is planes to take off simultaneously. And being the first to do that in this part of the country after Atlanta is what set the table for us to be a hub airport.
What would Charlotte have been like if we hadn't built the parallel runway?
I think Charlotte would have been Greensboro.
1978 was a defining year for Charlotte. The completion of Interstate 77 between Virginia and South Carolina reinforced the city's status as a distribution center. Voters approved selling liquor by the drink, and in 1978, IBM and Gold Bond Building Products moved huge operations to Charlotte. That began a wave of corporate relocations that would grow to include the Equitable, TIAA, American City Business Journals, Hearst, ESPN, MetLife, and more.
One of the things that had just happened in Charlotte was the location of a branch of IBM of 1,000 families came to Charlotte. I believe that was in 1978 or 1979. And the influx of 1,000 families, roughly 3,500 people, once the move was over, had a dramatic effect on Charlotte's reconsideration of who we were and who we are going to be. That began to change our needs in terms of education. IBM brought certain expectations with them that they needed from our school system, public school, K-12. Those things began all to work together with each other to show us that we did have, in fact, a way forward. I think the relocation of IBM showed that Charlotte could in fact be a major player far higher than we were thinking of ourselves at that point.
The tight relationship between official Charlotte and private enterprise was in full view when Johnny Harris and his brother-in-law Smokey Bissell recruited Gold Bond Building Products from Buffalo.
There's a prospect coming to Charlotte. They will not say who they are, where they're from. They came in, they had all their luggage tags cut off, and everybody went by their middle name. The CEO is Mr. J, J-A-Y. His name was Edward J. Killian. So Ed Killian was the CEO, but we just knew him as Mr. J. And we're sitting at dinner. And finally, one fellow looks at another fellow and he says, all right, let's tell them who we are. So they said, We're Gold Bond Building Products. We have lost, I can't remember, I want to say 57 days to weather in Buffalo, New York. Yeah. And they said, now, if we come, we're going to come fast. And I said, now, Johnny, nobody's ever done this before. And they got 230 families coming this way, so we got to make this thing happen. Most people in the construction business never see the people that they're building for. And Eddie Knox was mayor at the time, and so we'd say, Eddie, look, we really, really need your help. Because if people that are building a building can really see the mayor and get a chance to sort of see into and understand your importance. And so he came out twice to speak to everybody when they were having sort of dinner under the tree. And we would do it well after hours so you could serve beer too. That was important. And Eddie would come in and he would say, I want you to understand this. Only in Charlotte, North Carolina can this be done. And the eyes of the world are watching what you're doing here.
I don't know that I've ever made a pitch to a company coming to Charlotte or to North Carolina where I didn't say, you know, we're different. We work from can to can't. And they'll say, from can to can't? I said, yeah. We work from the time you can see till the time you can't see. We work all the time trying to make the place better, and we'll get the job done for you if you come be part of our community.
No one wants to relocate to a place with racial or public education problems, but Charlotte's leaders had to overcome past issues with both. In 1957, mobs tried to prevent Dorothy Counts from enrolling as the first black student at Harding High. Urban renewal of the Brooklyn neighborhood displaced hundreds of African American families. After he was elected the first black member of the city council, bombs rocked the homes of Fred Alexander and civil rights lawyer Julius Chambers.
This was 1965, the 64 Civil Rights Act on public accommodations had just been passed the previous year. We called it our first serious take on moving to Charlotte. And we got here late one weekday night. We couldn't find a motel room. We were driving down Wilkinson Boulevard. I'll never forget it as long as I live. And there are lots of these motels back then that you used to have. And none of them had no vacancy signs. But I quickly got the message. I drove up, asked for a room. Guy would look at me and say, sorry, we don't have any vacancies. Well, the first one you might say, oh, a little strange. Second, third, I think we tried 4. Bottom line of that is we started panicking and we said, do we really want to live here? I mean, do I want to come to Charlotte?
Influential citizens like C.D. Spangler Jr., a former president of the University of North Carolina system, were trying to change things. When white parents withdrew their children from public schools in response to integration, Spangler, a member of the local school board, stepped in.
When we moved back to Charlotte in the fall of '75, Dick Spangler called me up the first week I was here and said he'd like to eat lunch with me. So we met for lunch and he said, Rolf says, I want to beg you, please send your children to public schools. And I said, well, you don't have to beg me. That's where we're going to send them. He said, oh, I'm so glad to hear that. I said, why do you think we would send them otherwise? And I said, we've always sent them to public school. He said, well, we're having all this discussion in the community, and a lot of people who can afford it are pulling their children out and putting them in private schools. So it was really a no-brainer.
Meanwhile, city and black community leaders in the 1970s and 1980s built bridges through personal relationships. AME Zion Bishop George Battle Jr., the second African American elected to the school board, got to know Marin Department Store CEO John Belk at an early age.
I had worked my way up from the elevator board back to the janitor, back to working on from the basement all the way up on the first floor. That was the main floor for men. And I saw this guy coming in with some pants on that I thought I could really make a sale. There were 2 other salesmen in the store, obviously they knew him and I didn't. They said, "Did you know who you were dealing with?" I said, "No, but he certainly needed some pants, didn't he? And a shirt." They said, "You were talking to the guy who owned the Belt store. That's John Belt. He's one of the owners." I said, "Really?" And so from then on, he would come in and always ask about me. He was with me from when I was at my lowest ebb and we're at my highest point. When I was at my highest point, I was graduating from Livingstone, and when I graduated, I went over to the business office and they said, "You owe $250. And I had worked and I thought I'd paid my bill, and I don't know where they got that from. And so I didn't have any money, I didn't know how I was gonna pay it, so I went back over to my room and sat down and went to sleep. So got up and went to my mailbox. Don't even normally go there, but I went there and there was an envelope in there from Belt. Had in there, "Dear George, I appreciate all you do for us. Please find enclosed a little something to help for graduation, $250.
Belk was mayor when Battle successfully sought city approval for an enrichment program for poor children.
It was something about him that no matter what that was important to me, it was important to him, like my program. I would, if I had a problem, I would go to him and say, I'm having difficulties here and there. When I left there, it was solved. If he had to write a check himself, it was solved.
When Belk died in 2007, Bishop Battle delivered the eulogy. An awakening downtown, an influx of new businesses and people from somewhere else, a modern airport under construction, and if Charlotte had not yet figured out the answers to issues of race and education, at least it was working on them. As the 1980s dawned, Charlotte was ready for takeoff in more ways than one. No one did more to shape modern Charlotte than four self-appointed businessmen known as the Group.
The Group, to me, was one of the more powerful factors for positive growth that I've encountered in a career that now is about 50 years.
I was very aware of the Group when I was at Central Piedmont. I mean, the Group was no secret. There was a small group of guys who ran things.
This group of leaders wanted Atlanta, and they wanted to blow by that city as fast as they could, not necessarily become bigger, but be better.
But I saw what they did for this community as, in large part, very altruistic. I mean, they certainly would put personal interest aside to lead for what they thought was the greater good of the community, and the incidents I'm aware of where they really did leverage that power. And I think we were stronger for it. But it couldn't survive. I mean, it couldn't be that way today. If those same people were right here, back in their businesses, it simply couldn't be that way. The community's much more diverse and much more divided on any number of issues than it was in those days.
Bill Lee, Ed Crutchfield, Rolf Neal, Hugh McCall.
We got together on things that mattered to the city, and we would decide what should be done, and then we would do it. Saving the symphony was one of the things we did. I think symphony had gotten into the position of failing, and we got together and we talked it out and allocated money out. We decided what we were going to support. We never did anybody else's money. It was our company's. I think that all four of us, really none of us really actually cared about the symphony other than it was important to the city. I'll give you an example. Ed Crutchfield was going to run the drive for Johnson C. Smith University, first one ever. And I really didn't care about Johnson C. Smith at the time, but we held the first fundraiser on our penthouse because it was the most exciting place to be. So that night, I just pledged $1 million. So we would do things like that. And surely Ed helped me on something I wanted to do from time to time.
Ed had a model built of a building that resembled the Chrysler building in New York that he kept there in his office. And that was the building he was going to build that was going to be bigger than the one down the street. It was a very interesting time, and frankly, at times you didn't know whether you were an ally or a competitor with the bank down the street.
A lot of people say that Ed and I are friends. That was really not true. We didn't particularly like each other, I don't think, but we collaborated on things that mattered to the city. And he and I both would tell you jokingly that the only thing we really, really agreed on was we both hated Wachovia. This is the thing we really did agree on.
Clearly, Hugh and Eddie, they fought like the devil about each other. I mean, they wanted to beat each other's brains out. But you brought them together, whatever it was, they could sell together like two people you never saw. I mean, they were, man, oh man, they were as good as you ever saw together. And I mean, they would do that for the right situation. And whether it be sports or whether it be a community or even a company moving here.
I'm sure that they've been criticized as a group of, quote, guys getting in a room and making decisions for the city. Well, that's frankly exactly what happened. This group of individuals who were all white, they were all men, and I can understand that that looks to be less inclusive. But there was an inclusive, positive attitude among that group of individuals that I have never encountered directly or indirectly through conversation with my counterparts around this country. So it was an incredibly, a group of people that had incredible foresight, who had a vision of what Charlotte could be, and were willing to put their shoulder and their money behind it.
One of the group's most consistent priorities was promoting the arts. Michael Marsicano was working at the Arts Council in Durham when he was recruited to run Charlotte's Arts and Sciences Council.
So it was clear the leaders of Charlotte wanted Charlotte to be a great city. And a definition of a great city in their minds was to have a flourishing arts program. It was a point of recruitment for the talent that they were planning on bringing from other main cultural centers in big cities. So the arts really became an instrument to a greater concept of building a city and a business climate in that city. The development of the arts was really spearheaded by Hugh McCall. He would tell me about the cities that he had been to around the world, and he would talk about the arts and their impact on those communities, and he would share stories about recruitment efforts for talent that thought they were coming to the hinterlands of the South. That got him all flustered because, of course, he believes the South is the center of the universe. And so the idea that people thought of a southern city as being uncultured was just an anathema to him. And so he was determined to build the symphony and build the opera and build the museums in order to show that we were a sophisticated city and that people should want to come here.
McCall didn't hesitate to do the heavy lifting himself, and he was willing to commit serious bank money, as he did to obtain $15 million from the state to build the North Carolina Blumenthal Performing Arts Center. It started with a visit to Liston Ramsey, Speaker of the North Carolina House.
I made my little pitch to him, and he said, well, Mr. McCall, I don't know nothing about no tutu. But if you go down the hall at Bobby Etheridge and Eddie Knox, you can talk to them about it. Now, they were both chairman of budget committees. And so I told them what I wanted, which was $15 million from the state. And I must have made a good case because they agreed to do it. But, and of course I knew there was a but what they asked me was to support their candidate for governor, who was from Durham. I said, sure. Now, I guess our PAC gave whoever that was $1 million, but later, I was asked for another contribution, which we made, kind of being reminded that this was still in his committee, you know, whatever. So we did that too. We got what we wanted, which was the Blumenthal.
In 1997, the group confronted a major threat to Charlotte's image as a progressive city. County commissioners decided to withhold money from the Arts and Sciences Council because it had backed production of Angels in America. The Pulitzer Prize-winning play dealt with the AIDS epidemic and included full frontal male nudity.
Before 7 o'clock in the morning, I get a phone call from Ed Crutchfield saying, "We got to do something about this." I said, "I agree with you." And this was after the city council meeting. And that's when we put together the money to defeat the incumbent. We raised a lot of it that morning on the telephone call.
Y'all got together and started calling people?
No, we just, the two of us. We didn't call anybody. No, we weren't big into calling people.
The group's comfort in acting unilaterally was matched by its openness to ideas regardless of the source.
The great thing about Hugh McCall, Billy, Ed Crutchfield, and Rolf Neal and others were they were so open to good ideas. If you had a good idea, you could get an audience with Hugh McCall. And if he thought that was a good idea, he'd put money toward it, he'd run with it, and he'd help you.
If you look at successful cities, the civic side can't do it alone, the public side and the private side can't do it alone, but doing it together, frankly, it creates a synergy that Charlotte has distanced itself from the pack.
For each member of the group, there were a dozen others who shared the same drive, but whose efforts were narrower. Among them was George Shinn, who wanted to bring the big leagues to Charlotte. Track owner Bruton Smith had made Charlotte a center for stock car racing, but Shinn was interested in the classic sports. He called on Major League Baseball Commissioner Peter Ueberroth.
So Ueberroth slammed the door on me. I walked across the street to the NBA offices. So I'd already set up an appointment with David Stern and his entourage. And I remember asking him how much it cost to fill out an application. Seemed like it was $250,000. And to me, that blew my socks off at the time. Wow, just to fill out an application? But anyway, we did, and I mean, the rest was history.
Shinn needed to sell tickets, and he required something eye-opening to set Charlotte's bid apart from 10 other competitors.
George Shinn called me one night, and he said, "You know, I need your help selling tickets. I hear you might be able to help me sell tickets." I believe it was 5,000. I think that's the right number in order to apply. So I went to, where would you go? First place you would go, you went to Hugh McCall. I went to Hugh McCall. I said, "Hugh, I want you to buy 500 tickets and then go with me to see Ed Crutchfield." And so we did. And he said, "Sure, I'll do it. It's good for the city." I said, "Look, even if we don't get a team, just the fact we're being considered for a team is big news. If we get a team, there'll be Charlotte on scoreboards all over the country every night. I mean, you can't buy time like that." So we went in to see Stewart, and Stewart was just a great citizen. He said, "Well, I'll have to talk to Alan," and just then Alan called in. So Alan didn't get the full story, but they committed for 500 tickets. And then we went to see Ed Crutchfield, who was having corporate portrait made that day, and we just barged in on him. And he committed for 500 tickets. And then Rick Hendrick, who had NASCAR experience, got Winston and Coke and so forth, and they got the 5,000 tickets.
During that time when I was struggling trying to get a good deal with the Coliseum Authority because it was going to help me get a franchise. And the people on that board just couldn't see the vision. But one guy did. It was Harvey Gantt. God bless him.
A newspaper article provided a final bit of motivation.
People will trust you more and believe you know what you're talking about if you don't use notes. So I went in there and I practiced all night, and the sun started coming up. I decided I was just going to go out and breathe some fresh air. And so I brought the newspaper in. And on the comment for us, it said the only franchise Charlotte would get is one with golden arches. You talking about firing me up. I look back on the time and when we were struggling and we had the CH factor. You know, is it Charleston? Is it Charlottesville? Is it Charlotte? You know, is it North Carolina, South? Where is it? And now you mentioned Charlotte, you don't have to say North Carolina. Back then you did. I think it put the city on the map.
Here's Morning, the shot, game over!
We started talking about what we could do. If we had a new building, could we explore a commitment from the ACC and a commitment from the NCAA? It was John Belt, Steve Camp, Jim Martin, myself, and Hugh McCall. And we all knew what each guy was supposed to say and address. And it goes to John Belt, and here we are in front of the NCAA selection committee, and he says, "This sort of reminds me of the old railroad station in Charlotte." Now I'm telling you, at no time had anybody ever heard those words come out of his mouth. So we were into a balconies. We did not know what was going to happen.
But Harris and the Charlotte group had a secret weapon.
We even got Arnold Palmer to fly in here and do part of the film that we use, the video. And he stood in front of the Coliseum under construction, said, "I'm famous for playing in good foursomes, and you have the greatest foursome in sports, and we have the place where you need to come and play, and that's Charlotte."
The 9 guys in the room, their eyes got big as hubcaps when Arnold Palmer came on. Harris said, "I knew we had it." The last page on it says, "We commit in excess to $1 million to support this event." And in the meeting, when it came to Q&A, someone asked, "How can you guarantee $1 million?" And Hugh McCall looked at John Belt, they said, "I think John and I can commit to it right now. You've got that commitment." And that was, they said they just laughed.
Belk and McCall didn't end up having to go it alone.
Oh, it came from Duke Power, from Bank of America, or back then NCNB, and First Union, and Piedmont Natural Gas, all the usual suspects. Yeah. I mean, you know, the one thing about it is every time you go to war here, you can generally get the people to get in there with you. And that's the important thing, because, you know, they've got their businesses to run, and if you'll help out and make this city better, it makes it better for their employees, it makes it better for them attracting intellectual assets.
With the 1994 Final Four booked, Charlotte was like the dog that had finally caught the car.
We had a city with no bars downtown. We had a cafeteria.
It was devoid of entertainment, restaurants. It was, I mean, truthfully, it shut down at about 6 or 6:30.
We even had Ivy's upstairs, little place to eat, but you couldn't use that. And so we didn't know what we were going to do, because we knew we'd have 100,000 people here that didn't go to the game.
And then we came up with the idea of Street of Champions, and that we would turn it into a street festival.
But we had 2 things. We had laws that didn't allow open containers. Well, you've never been to a Final Four where people weren't walking around with an open container downtown. I mean, I'm sorry that happens. You know, we got to figure out how to do that. So we got the state to pass an ordinance that allowed us to have open containers for 2 weeks. And we then took downtown and we built 11 bars, and it was unreal what we did. And it was a celebration, and we had no problems with crime or anything. It showed what we could do if we put our mind to it.
It could not have turned out better. It was incredible. We sold, I think, over $1 million worth of draft beer in 4 days.
And there is Jerry Richardson shaking the hand of the NFL Commissioner Paul Tagliabue. Jerry Richardson, now an owner of an NFL football team.
Charlotte ascended to the top tier of the sports world in 1993, when the National Football League awarded its 29th franchise to former player Jerry Richardson.
When I get back to Charlotte, I'm going to say, thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you.
He came to see me in 1987, and he wanted to get a team. I tell the story, and he laughs about it, but I humored him because I thought, hell, this is not going to happen, but I'll humor him and I'll go along with it.
So I came to see Hugh in April, and it was midday, Pat was his assistant at the time. We went into what he called the war room. And I told him I had something very serious I wanted to talk to him about. So I spent an hour telling him I wanted to try to get an NFL team for the Carolinas. It wasn't specifically Charlotte, it was for the Carolinas because I was living in South Carolina. And he took notes the whole time. And when I left, he gave the notes to Pat. He said, well, I just humored Jerry for 1 hour. And he said, just file those somewhere. And that's the way we started. And of course, as we know it, he got more involved. He did more than humor me. I don't want you to take this the wrong way, but I had more confidence in Mr. McCall than I did Charlotte. So I don't know what was the bigger attraction. And I'm not making light of the subject, but the fact is this is where Hugh was. If he had been in Winston-Salem, who knows? Or if he had been in Columbia, who knows? He was the key part of it. We weren't asking the taxpayers to build the stadium, so it had to be financed. As it's turned out, of course, Charlotte's the perfect place for us to be.
I think it establishes the fact that we're a city now that has special events that are indicative of other great cities throughout the country. Now, we're not at the same place when you go to talking about the economic impacts of New York City or Washington or Chicago or Los Angeles. But the fact of the matter is, after you get past those 4 cities, they may not want to admit it, but everybody else is looking at what we're doing in Charlotte because we're doing great things.
Meanwhile, newly hired CEO Harry Nurkin was transforming Charlotte's public hospital into a multi-state 900-location system and the city's largest employer.
Harry set up a retreat with what was then Anders Consulting and is now Accenture. And they essentially told us, your mission is to take care of the indigent. And the way to do that is take care of the most affluent, most educated people in town. And that's how you can give better health care to the indigent. That was revolutionary in Charlotte, North Carolina. Revolutionary. So all of a sudden, for this public hospital that had been the hospital of, at one time, most of the indigent, it shook the town up, shook the medical community up. Care wasn't the issue. It was modernizing the look of the hospital. We wanted people to know that we were a first-class hospital. That's the crux of the whole matter. And this wasn't a public hospital that had no carpets and no paintings on the wall. This was a first-class place, and you would be taken care of as if you were in a Marriott hotel, or the Ritz-Carlton for that matter.
Another must was changing the name from Charlotte Memorial Hospital.
I was sitting at a dinner, and I think it was the athletic club, and Ed Crutchfield was there, Stewart was there, Ace Walker was there, and Hugh McCall was there. And we were talking about renaming the hospital because Harry deemed, and he would correctly, that Memorial was a bad name. It kind of essentially said you're going to die. It was going to become Charlotte Healthcare System. And someone at that table said, why would we do that? We're talking about regionalism. Why wouldn't we make it Carolina's healthcare system? Both McCall and Crutchfield were spreading out. They were much more than Charlotte. I was in the same boat. So all of us were kind of like, why would you want to be Charlotte? Charlotte's not big enough to be important. You got to create mass. You got to be at least regional. The people sitting at that table all understood when it was suggested. It just went boom, oh yeah, that's it, let's do it. We don't need a study. The group did create it and recognize it instantly.
Charlotte leaders were also determined to upgrade its position in higher education. In 1989, a committee searching for a new chancellor reached out to Jim Woodward at the University of Alabama, Birmingham.
Charlotte was then the largest city, the largest metropolitan area in the country without a doctoral granting institution. So they wanted to build a university, but if I talked with an individual about what does that mean, it would mean different things, except Tom Stores. I very much remember talking with Tom about it. He had gone to the University of Virginia, had stayed engaged with the University of Virginia, so that was what was in his mind. Obviously, UNC Charlotte had a long way to go before it was a University of Virginia, but if you looked at the programs that UNC Charlotte has today, except for medical programs, it pretty much has what the University of Virginia has.
By 1994, the first PhD candidates were on campus. Charlotte trustees also wanted the new chancellor to live in a home befitting the university's rising status and in a location easily accessible to Charlotte's leaders.
The chair of the Board of Trustees at the time I came was Tom Stores, that I had mentioned. Stuart Dixon was vice chair of the Board of Trustees. They had raised money to build a new chancellor's house. The university was given a piece of property, which is worth a bunch of money then and now. It was all private, there's no state money in it, yeah. It was the trustees, it would have been Tom, would have been Stuart, would have been the Harris family, and Smokey Bissell, all of those were involved with it. Tom Stores and Sarah Bissell was on the Board of Trustees as well. The two of them actually designed the house, and Sarah wanted to make sure that it was properly decorated. So she personally picked out everything that went into the main floor there. Because you think about it, the first thing that so many people saw associated with UNC Charlotte was that house. And that was where the initial view of UNC Charlotte was.
When Alabama tried to lure Woodward back, business leaders raised money to allow him to stay.
I felt sort of guilty that they all thought we were going to leave, and we weren't going to leave anyway. But the next year or so is when we recruited TIAA Craft, and the university played a major role, and I felt like, okay, I have returned their commitment to the university, to me personally, in a way that I felt good about. I can give you so many examples in other metropolitan areas where the university there was a creation of the state. UNC Charlotte is a creation of this community, and by that I mean a creation of the leadership of this community, business and political leadership of this community.
Charlotte's leaders often felt the great state of Mecklenburg got short shrift from budget makers in Raleigh. Their response was to raise money themselves. The names on facilities at public institutions like the Performing Arts Center, UNC Charlotte, Central Piedmont Community College, and Carolina's healthcare system, and at private institutions like Queen's University, Johnson C. Smith, and Novant Health, testify to the role of philanthropy in Charlotte's growth.
The corporate leaders set an expectation that philanthropy was a civic responsibility of every individual who had the capacity to give something. Mr. McCall said it well. He said we have to do well in order to do good, but when we do well, we have a responsibility to do good. And that became our culture. That became our DNA for this community.
In the 40s, and certainly in the 30s, but in the 40s and 50s, women were not on the boards of either that church or the community organizations. They were auxiliary groups. And so Claire Tate and Mary Lou Babb decided to form in Charlotte something called the Women's Impact Fund. And that started in 2003 with the idea that women would decide where they wanted their money to go. They would write their own checks. I remember the day it kicked off, I was asked to say the prayer. And it was at the Duke Mansion, and there was something like 123 women there. That was 2003. They have a membership of over 425 now. So that's a remarkable change.
So it really stems from corporate Charlotte to begin with. And corporate Charlotte led many campaigns that engaged people in what we needed to do next, whether it be the arts or the environment or human services.
Now the head of the Foundation for the Carolinas, Marcicano experienced that firsthand when he made a call to Family Dollar CEO Leon Levine on behalf of the Arts and Sciences Council.
I remember when he was the CEO of Family Dollar, and we were 24 hours away from the end of the Arts and Science Council's annual campaign. We were $300,000 down toward the campaign goal. My wife goes into labor. We're in the delivery room, and I asked her if she was okay and would she mind if I continued to make some calls on the campaign, which tells you how wonderful my wife is. So Leon had not given his gift yet. So I called him up on the phone. I said, Leon, we're 24 hours down in the campaign. I need you to be there for me. And he said, well, tell me what I gave last year. I don't remember. And I said, Leon, I don't have it in front of me. I'm in the delivery room with my wife. She's about to give birth to our second son. And he said, if you're calling from me the delivery room with that kind of commitment, put me down for whatever you want. And he hung up the phone.
Smokey Bissell has epitomized Charlotte's leaders' willingness to both give and ask for money.
I had the Levine Children's Hospital and the university, and then I did one for the Heinemann and medical research. I've done Queens University. I'd never been on the campus before. And I had a phone call from Bill Lee, and he said, Smoke, I need to come talk to you on Friday about something I'm sure you'll be interested in. It was the best line I ever heard. So, sure, Bill. So, Friday, they call up and they say from the desk, we were over in a two-story office, and said, because I got Bill Lee coming at 9 o'clock. They said, well, Mr. McCall and Mr. Crutchfield are here, but Mr. Lee is running a little bit late. I said, oh, we were going to make a lot of money on this one today, you know. And that was to get me to do this Queens University campaign. It was about a $12 million campaign, as I recollect. But I mean, that's the way you got things done in Charlotte.
Charlotte's growth dictated that the era where a few people called the shots and shouldered the burdens couldn't last. In 1977, voters forced a change to begin electing some city council members by districts. Future Mayor Harvey Gantt shared the voters' frustrations.
It grated against me because I didn't think that it was contrary to the growth of a really great city that you could have a relatively small group of men make the most important economic decisions for the community. I thought that was not a good idea, and I didn't come up with the idea of how to change that. What started to change it was district representation. In '75, on my first election to the council, and Betty Chafin's election there, we were two advocates on the council that said, we do need to have broader representation. This is a growing city. And it doesn't make sense that everybody ought to belong to Myers Park Presbyterian Church except for one token black who lives in one other part of the city. Come on. If we really want to espouse the goals that the chamber has of this becoming a dynamic New South City, there are some things that had to be given up. One of them was all the decisions can't be made by a small group of people.
Also changing the dynamic was the transformation of homegrown businesses like Bill Lee's Duke Power, Hugh McCall's North Carolina National Bank, and Ed Crutchfield's First Union into huge, nationally oriented corporations.
You know, we're facing the resegregation of the schools. We're facing huge transportation issues. We're facing, levels of poverty that we wouldn't have dreamed of many years ago, and these are, in some ways, harder challenges to find solutions for. Affordable housing issues. We're beginning to have the challenges of a big city that comes with all the greatness of a big city. How do you keep a give and receive culture going with the sheer number of people that are moving in? I worry about that because few cities have the civic energy that we have. Very few have it. So how do you educate it to the new people that are coming in? The second thing I worry about is the loss of relationship between corporate Charlotte and government Charlotte. If we don't keep the close ties between corporations here and government and elected leaders, we will lose the public-private partnerships and relationships that have really built this city.
All of us pitched in because we liked Charlotte. We loved Charlotte. So the question is, do our new CEOs love Charlotte? Do they care about the city they now live in? That's the critical issue. You have to care. And if you care, you'll do something. And you won't just do it for Uptown, you'll do it for the West Side, you'll do it for wherever it needs to happen. And so I think the answer to that, my own question is yes, they do care. I think we're going to make progress. So I'm optimistic we can do it. But we've got to pay attention.
We're an amazing community when it comes to doing the right thing. But it always goes back to Mr. Dowd and Mr. Dixon and Mr. Belk and Bill Lee and all those guys sitting around and you know, they saw each other a lot. And if it was the right thing to do, they got it done. And I think that everything we do in this community now is we're all trying to leave it better than we found it.